Hi, I'm Alex Jules, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
Was the witness's testimony influenced by a factor such as bias or prejudice, a personal relationship with someone involved in the case, or a personal interest in how the case is decided? So according to this, it sounds like we should not extend the benefit of the doubt to, say, somebody who traveled with the defendant for 3 years and was so convinced that this was the Son of God that they couldn't shut up about it.
She did an excellent job of filling in the blanks, but a poor job of covering the essential details of the crime that others had already described. If I had not repeatedly asked her to start at the beginning and tell me everything she saw, she would undoubtedly have given me an incomplete account that, if compared to the first statements of eyewitnesses, would have looked like a contradiction.
Important clarification needs to be made here. Missing details are not the same thing as contradictions. And I'll fully grant that there are atheists who, if you see the list on the internet of top 100 Bible contradictions or something like that, they'll have some stuff in there that's not technically a contradiction. And that's a problem. Atheists should stop talking about those things. But there are absolutely real contradictions or stuff that looks like contradictions, not just missing details, but stuff that actually are, they're talking about two different versions of events that certainly appear to be contradictory and to my mind are contradictory, and you need to reckon with those. So why does Wallace redefine contradiction in a way that makes it easier to dismiss? Why does he not talk about actual alleged contradictions and not just missing details?
He's skirting the issue.
Exactly, yeah. It's
look over here, look at the shiny object. That's what this is.
Yeah, same thing where he misidentifies philosophical naturalism as methodological naturalism. He's not going after the strongest arguments, and in fact going out of his way to redefine things to make his case easier. And I don't think that's a good technique when applied by either side of the debate.
You think he's doing that on purpose? Is that deliberate?
He has to know what a contradiction is, right?
Yeah.
Either he's disingenuous or he's dumb, and I
would
don't
go with
know
the former.
which speaks better for him.
All right.
Some aspects of each eyewitness statement may be completely identical. This is particularly true when witnesses describe aspects of the crime that were dramatic or important to the sequence of events.
Several of the accounts, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, contain blocks of identical or nearly identical descriptions. This may be the result of common agreement at particularly important points of the narrative, or, more likely, the result of later eyewitnesses saying, "The rest occurred just the way he said." Why would eyewitnesses just flatly plagiarize other eyewitnesses? The whole point of an eyewitness account is to explain what you saw and how you felt about it. If Matthew and Luke were written by people who knew Mark, were aware of his story, and wanted to refer to it, they would write their own account while explicitly referring to Mark and expressing agreement with his story. References to any other work would be folded into personal recollections, not straight lifted word for word. The fact that Wallace reads word for word repetition this way gives me very strong suspicion that he approached the Bible as a believer and wrote about it as a believer. No skeptic would take what he does from the Gospels.
Were they copied from Mark? I mean, that's pretty widely accepted among biblical scholars, both Christian and secular. So why is Wallace not aware of this? Why doesn't he address this predominant theory in biblical scholarship? He's already explained that detectives keep eyewitnesses separate so they don't influence each other's accounts.
He made a point of saying that. The first thing he does while he's still on the phone, when they say we got a homicide, the first thing he does as he's putting on his suit to get out there, it's going to be an hour before I get out there. In the meantime, the only thing he doesn't want to know anything about what's going on at the crime scene other than he just wants all the witnesses separated.
So by his own standards, the worst thing that could happen is for another witness to have a written copy of another witness's testimony, because of course that's going to color his own. And yet that's exactly what the majority of scholars believe happened with Mark, Matthew, and Luke.
And he touts it as a selling point when he speaks against it as a homicide investigator.
Yeah, I mean, once again, applying his own standards to the Gospels, the Gospel writers are suboptimal eyewitnesses.
Oh yeah, and like you said, it is consensus that, I mean, it's an objective fact that 65% of Matthew, 65% of Mark is found in Matthew, and 95% of Mark is found in Luke.
And even if you don't buy that theory, this...
No, we could look at Mark right now and compare him against, we could count sentence for sentence, word for word, and that's an objective fact.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying that, okay, they copied each other word for word because they happen to view the same things. But that doesn't mean they're going to write it down using the exact same phrases. That's just ridiculous.
No, that's Control-C, Control-V right there. That's all that is.
When eyewitnesses encounter an event that is similarly unique, unrepeated, and powerful, they are far more likely to remember it and recall specific details accurately. Because, I mean, we saw this with this example with the Ford case, but with the opposite argument. Because Dr. Ford, when she was giving the testimony about Judge Kavanaugh, they were arguing that her testimony should have been more complete, but in actuality, she herself is an expert in this field, and she was saying that her recollection cannot be complete because of the emotion around it. So if it's unique and powerful and amazing, that has a similar effect, I would think, that if it has an emotional tie and it's almost traumatic in that way, then you will have details missing. And eyewitness accounts, certain details are burned into your memory, which is why we believed Ford, because of who it was that she was attacked by. But the details of where she was and exactly when it happened, she's not expected to remember those things because of the nature of the memory that she has. So we can't really rely on all the details of these accounts, even if they were eyewitness accounts.
How would you be able to tell if they didn't record the details accurately? How do you know these aren't fish stories, specifically Jesus fish stories, that they've grown the more and more they tell them? I mean, we know that the Bible went through a period of oral storytelling before they put it to paper, and yet he's trying to say that they would not have even inadvertently embellished the story during that entire time. I mean, Wallace compares it to his once-in-a-lifetime wedding, which is a very profound moment, a wonderful moment in his own life. But even then, you can corroborate his wedding story with all the photographs that were taken, all the guests that were there. You have ways to confirm it. You don't just have to take his word for it. But biblically, that's kind of what we're stuck with.
The first book I wrote, I used Grammarly. I don't know why I'm advertising Grammarly. I'm not getting a penny for this, folks. But I used the Grammarly program, and it is awesome. It just works wonders. So when I had I used it throughout the entire process. But at the end, I just thought, oh, I'll just try this plagiarism checker. I did not plagiarize anything, and it showed 35% plagiarized. Mm-hmm. I was like, what the fuck? So I went back and looked. It considered plagiarism anything with like keywords in it in the same order. All right, so I guess I was channeling Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and Dennett quite a bit. And so in Wallace's defense, I can kind of see that. But oral tradition is not, no matter how good your memory is, it's not going to be like it appears in Matthew and Luke. It's not going to look that similar.
Yeah, and even ignoring the copying issue, I mean, we know human memories are fallible. We know that the mind has a way of plugging in details and almost crafting bits and pieces out of whole cloth to try and make sense of things. And he's trying to say that these people, after 30 years, still remembered all these little events as if they were there that day. It's just completely goes against what we know about the human mind.
As we examine the gospel accounts, we need to give the writers the same benefit of the doubt that we would give other eyewitnesses. Human eyewitnesses produce human eyewitness accounts. They are often idiosyncratic and personal, but reliable nonetheless. As a Christian, I recognize that the Bible is God's Word, but I also recognize that it was delivered to us through the observations and recollections of human eyewitnesses. Honestly, this just seems like a way to get around the fact that the Bible is written by fallible men. It's a way to both acknowledge that flaw and dismiss it at the same time, which to me seems a bit disingenuous. Firstly, how would we be able to discern between a paragraph written by man and a paragraph written by man with God's influence? This is the same problem we run into with something like the Quran, where proponents of Islam will say that a document can never be reproduced that is like the Quran. And yet, how would we possibly be able to discern a document being produced like the Quran or any other document? More importantly, how would we be able to confirm that a document has even been produced that is like the document in question? And if one is successful in creating such a document, what's stopping the proponent of Islam from simply backpedaling and refuting that the document was produced in such a manner as described? I would argue that between both the Bible and the Quran, there's no real way to discern when something is written with God's influence and when something is written with nothing more than the petty eyes of man. As a result, I'm left with only two options. I can either dismiss the entire book as clearly man-made, or I can venerate the entire book as clearly God's word. Based on the multitude of religions that exist in the world, I would think it's more likely that instead of the one God out of thousands being the one that produced this book, that it was produced by man. As a result, we would expect this book to be laden with all of the same fundamental flaws that any other human creation is. From my perspective, instead of trying to work around an apologetic to make up for the fact that the Bible is flawed, I can instead accept it as a piece of literature that is flawed by the fact that it is created by human hands, but that is no less respected than a classic piece of literature. The stories of Shakespeare are neither perfect nor original, but we still venerate them as classics. The same can be said about the Bible. It has its place in both history and literature, but neither it nor the works of Shakespeare are perfect, and both it and the works of Shakespeare are also created by fallible human hands. Just like the Quran.
Is it just me, or do believers call the Bible God-breathed when they want to be authoritative scripture, but they point to its human origins when they want to explain all its idiosyncrasies, where things appear to be factually wrong or contradictory? Trying to have it both ways. Like, if it's God-breathed, God should be able to craft a narrative that makes sense and is free of the kind of mistakes that give skeptics like you and I a reason to doubt its accuracy.
It's kind of like when you throw out a Bible verse and it's something that comports with modern day morals, modern day law, and sure, see, that's God breathed. That's divine. See, he thought that, it's been that way this whole time. God, He's known this all along. This is the law. But when you shoot another fact at him, another Bible verse at him, and it's one that maybe slavery. Oh, well, that's a context of the time. It was the context of the time. That changed. Men wrote that. Or something that's completely like a talking snake or a talking donkey. Oh, well, that's allegorical. Mm-hmm. It becomes allegorical when it's convenient for them, and gospel, quote unquote, when it serves their purpose.
It's very selective. Either it comes for God, or it's a metaphor, or it's from the culture of the time, or we don't follow that law anymore because Jesus fulfilled it, or something like that. There's all kinds of weasel ways you can kind of wriggle your way out of some of these binds if you just select which explanation makes sense for each individual instance. But you kind of think about, okay, what about this book as a whole? Is it as a whole, did God have any control over it at all? Did he allow this stuff to slip through? Or more likely, is it all human-based and is subject to all the human foibles that we would expect from a human work?
From Peter in Rome to James in Jerusalem to Thomas in Malapore, the apostles appear to have been ultimately interrogated in locations that prevented them from communicating with one another in a timely manner. They had no idea if any of their co-conspirators had already given up the lie and saved themselves by simply confessing that Jesus was never resurrected. Okay, for the sake of argument, let's grant the veracity of the claims that the apostles all existed and were martyred as this passage lays out. Simply because they all believed something, that doesn't make it true. There are a large amount of assumptions required to get there. If ardent belief in something were enough for something to be ascertained to be true, every religion is true because they all have ardent believers. All of them. Every single one.
So this is from a chapter where Wallace is comparing witnesses being pitted against one another to the disciples who were facing persecution and potential martyrdom for their own for their beliefs. But it's not the same thing, because he talks about, at the beginning of the chapter, he talks about these two witnesses who didn't know what the other person was saying. They didn't know if the other person was going to rat out the other in exchange for a lighter sentence or something like that. So when your witnesses are in that situation, they have incentives to rat the other person out, to give all the information in exchange for leniency for themselves. And he's trying to say that, hey, the apostles didn't do that under persecution, but it's not the same thing, because you can't say that Thomas over in India was under pressure to rat out Peter in Rome, as if anything Thomas said could have any impact on Peter. They're strictly under their own, responsible for their own lives, and the fact that they didn't rat each other out is not a point in their favor when that's not something that could have even, that wouldn't even come into play. That's not a pressure they were under.
I've got two things on this one. First, dying for something you believe in is way more common than most believers want to give us credit for. We are very prone to die for something we believe in. My fellow Marines died, some of them died in Iraq when I was over there. They believed in the Constitution of the United States of America. 19 terrorists believed in something strongly enough to kill themselves on 9/11. The Heaven's Gate, or they were following that. They actually thought there was a spaceship following in the tail, the comma of the Hale-Bopp comet, and they wanted a seat aboard that thing, and they were ready to kill them. They killed themselves. Was it 900 something people in Jonestown drank that Kool-Aid of their own volition? Well, most of them. People are ready to lay down for something they believe in. It's, they glorify and lionize the disciples that withstood all this, and it's way more prevalent than we give them credit for.
Yeah, and the common apologetic will be that, well, no one dies for a lie. People will not sacrifice themselves for what,
then you have to believe the Hale-Bopp comet story. You have to believe Jim Jones was Jesus.
Yeah, and that's the issue, is because, okay, maybe they weren't lying. Maybe they sincerely believed and were wrong. And
that's the more likely, isn't it?
That people are wrong all the time. We know that about people, and that's another I'm not sure if I have a specific quote about this, but that's another explanation that Wallace does not address. He says either they're lying or they're telling the truth. They definitely weren't lying because they wouldn't die for it. Therefore, they must be telling the truth.
That's a bifurcation.
And ignores the middle ground.
Yep.
It's just not that
excluded
easy.
Middle, right? The other thing is, this is a big if that you were talking about, that the disciples actually were put on. We know people were put on trial for this. Mm-hmm. There's a big if that excluded middle, bifurcation, false dichotomy. There's other explanations. Memories are fallible, first off. Just last night, I rewatched for probably the 100th time Life of Brian. And it struck me, so, if it's been a while since you've seen it, I highly recommend go back and watch it. But there's, towards the end, Brian, people are starting to catch on that, hey, he might be the Messiah because he was up on a soapbox because he fell down from he was escaping the Romans, and he just ended up on a soapbox with the other prophets on every street corner, this whole line of false prophets. And so he's trying to look like a prophet for a while, just fake the funk, right? And so he just starts spouting stuff out of his mouth, and he stops in mid-sentence, and they're like, what do we need to, what else? And he just gets down off the soapbox and runs away, and they're like, no, you didn't finish your statement. So that started, it was like 2 or 3, then it became a dozen, then it was like half the towns following him through the desert, and he's trying to run from them now. Well, when he jumped down off the soapbox, he gave this random woman, a gourd he was holding in his hand. And so when he disappeared, they're all talking to each other about what was he going to say. And then they turn and he goes, where did he go? Oh, he is risen. He disappeared. No, there he is. And so they're running after him. And this gourd became magical. Mm-hmm. Then as they're chasing him, he loses a sandal in the desert. They find it. The sandal, this has a meaning. It's got a sign. Mm-hmm. So cut to next scene, where they're in the town square and they're waiting for him to arrive, and they've all got these sticks with sandals and gourds hanging off of them, and these became holy relics now. And it's a comedy, but it goes to my point that these disciples might have really believed what they think they saw, but maybe a mass delusion, mass hysteria, might have played a part in that, where someone added something to it. Yeah, I saw that too. And then someone else added something. Oh, I saw that. It's very human to do that.
It's certainly possible. I mean, think about, people, like, it's what we know about human nature. People exaggerate, people embellish, even if they're not trying to. People want to be part of something. They want to glob on to a fad or be a part of something big. If Jesus was a brand new hashtag on Twitter, he'd have like 20,000 tweets within 30 seconds, whether he was real or not. People just want to be a part of that, and I think that's a perfectly valid explanation to think that this was a guy who was revered by a lot of people, and his legend just grew and grew and grew until we have Magic Man, Son of God, who will come back one day to save the whole world. And it's.
You said fish story. It's perfect. That's a perfect analogy, because Grandpa, when he comes back from the fishing trip, he talks about it. It's a little bit bigger than what he caught. The fish is already gone, or maybe the one that got away, right? And it's a little bit bigger than what it actually was. But then a year later, and he's not purposely doing, usually maybe not purposely doing that. I can see times where Grandpa's not purposely doing that. He just wants it to be as big as possible. So in his mind, he keeps seeing it an inch or two longer each year, until before you know it, it's this big ass fish.
Like the Gospels almost do that too. Like, I saw Jesus and he fed 4,000 people. I saw Jesus and he fed 5,000 people. And it's, yeah.
While skeptics sometimes claim that these recorded locations of martyrdom are unreliable because they are part of a biased Christian account, there isn't a single non-Christian record that contradicts the claim of martyrdom offered by the local communities and historians. This is one of my favorite stupid arguments. Well, if the Christian account isn't true, why didn't anybody back then correct it? If the apostles and their martyrdom were the product of legend, there would have been nothing to see. And until the varying rumors gained traction, solidified into an official account, and were put down on paper well after the fact, it's possible nobody found them significant. We see the Christian movement become historically significant, but that's with the benefit of hindsight, and we have no reason to assume contemporaries of the original reports gave them any credence whatsoever. Can I prove this happened? No. But there's no reason to assume it didn't, and thus there's no reason to assume we should be forced into a false dilemma between the stories being true and someone contradicting the stories.
That's not how this works, though. I mean, you don't just take the word of whatever account you have just because you don't have any other contradictory accounts. Like, if I tell you that there was a UFO flying above me on my way to work, and no one else comes out and say, there was no UFO flying over you on your way to work, are you just going to believe me just by default because that's the only story you have? That you got to be able to actually back your stuff up at some point.